The HOA Karen who called 911 on me for trespassing had no clue I owned the entire county, including her $1 million house. 3 squad cars screaming up my dirt road at 7 a.m. Delilah Thornfield steps out in designer heels, stabbing her manicured finger at me like I'm public enemy number 1. "Officer, arrest him! He's illegally occupying HOA property!" I'm sitting there in my grandfather's rocking chair, steam rising from my coffee mug, pine needles crunching under police boots. The sheriff looks mortified. Small town, he knows me. I reach into my flannel pocket, unfold a yellowed document. "Sheriff, you might want to see this." His jaw drops. It's the original 1890s land grant. Every acre she's standing on, mine. Her precious subdivision, built on my family's homestead. The diesel fumes couldn't mask Delilah's panic sweat as reality hit her. What would you do if someone tried to evict you from your own land? Drop your craziest HOA nightmare below and tell me where you're watching from. Let me back up and tell you how this whole mess started. My name's Rex Caldwell, and I'm what you might call an old-school mountain man. Third-generation logger, spent the last 20 years working oil rigs in Alaska, saving every penny. When my dad passed 2 years ago, I inherited the family cabin, a solid log structure my great-grandfather built in 1890 on original homestead land in Pinevale County, Montana. The cabin sits on 40 acres of prime mountain real estate, complete with a crystal-clear creek and enough timber to build a small town. It's been in our family for over a century, passed down through handshake deals and faded paper deeds. The smell of cedar logs and wood smoke has been my childhood lullaby, the crunch of pine needles under bare feet my summer soundtrack. But here's where things get interesting. While I was up in Alaska dodging polar bears and making bank, some fancy developers decided my quiet little valley was perfect for their luxury project. They built Alpine Vista Estates, a gated community where city folks pay $800,000 for the privilege of pretending they're mountain people. Enter Delilah Thornfield. Mid-40s, former corporate lawyer from Seattle, drives a white Tesla that probably costs more than most people's houses. She moved here 3 years ago, bought the biggest house in the development, and immediately got herself elected HOA president. The woman treats that position like she's running for Supreme Court justice. Delilah's got this thing about community standards and property values. What she really means is she can't stand the sight of us locals who don't fit her Pinterest-perfect vision of mountain living. She's got subtle ways of letting you know you don't belong, that condescending smile, the way she calls grown men sweetie, how she always mentions her law degree when disagreeing with you. My first real encounter with Princess Delilah happened on a Tuesday morning. I'm splitting firewood behind my cabin when I hear heels clicking on my wooden porch. She's standing there in a cream-colored business suit, holding a clipboard like it's Excalibur. "Mr. Caldwell, I presume?" She doesn't wait for an answer. "I'm Delilah Thornfield, president of the Alpine Vista Homeowners Association. We need to discuss your property's compliance issues." I set down my axe, wiped the sweat from my forehead. "Ma'am, I appreciate the visit, but I'm not part of your HOA." Her laugh could have frozen the creek. "Oh, sweetie, I'm afraid that's where you're mistaken. Your little cabin sits right in the middle of our community. That makes you subject to our covenants and restrictions." She hands me a certified letter demanding $25,000 in mandatory improvements. New siding, approved paint colors, professional landscaping, the works. 30 days to comply or face daily $500 fines. The taste of well water, metallic and pure, couldn't wash the bitter flavor of injustice from my mouth. "Now listen here, miss." "Dr. Thornfield," she corrected. "I didn't spend 7 years in law school to be called miss." I pulled out my grandfather's original survey map, yellowed with age but legally binding. "Ma'am, this property predates your development by 130 years. I'm not subject to any HOA." She barely glanced at it. "That old paperwork is irrelevant in today's legal environment. You'll comply with our standards, or we'll make sure you do." Her heels clicked away like a countdown timer. That night, I sat on my porch with a mason jar of grandfather's moonshine, watching the lights twinkle in those fancy houses below. General Patton, my bloodhound, sensed the tension and rested his massive head on my knee. The mountain air carried the scent of coming trouble. I didn't know it yet, but Delilah Thornfield had just declared war on the wrong mountain man. What she couldn't possibly understand was that my family didn't build this cabin, we built this entire county. And some legal documents have a way of surfacing when you need them most. But first, I had to survive her opening assault. Delilah didn't waste time turning up the heat. 3 days after her little visit, I'm enjoying my morning coffee when I spot a convoy rolling up my driveway. County code enforcement, 3 inspectors with clipboards, measuring tapes, and the kind of official attitudes that make honest folks nervous. "Mr. Caldwell?" The lead inspector looked like he'd rather be anywhere else. "We've received multiple complaints about possible building code violations. Mind if we take a look around?" Behind them, Delilah sat in her pristine Tesla, engine purring like a satisfied cat, watching through designer sunglasses. The woman had been busy. I could smell the diesel exhaust from their trucks mixing with her expensive perfume as she supervised from her climate-controlled throne. I invited the inspectors in for coffee and homemade jerky. These guys were just doing their jobs, no point making enemies. While they poked around with their instruments, I remembered something my grandfather used to say. "Son, when city lawyers come calling, you better know more law than they do." That's when I pulled out the research I'd been doing since Delilah's threat. Turns out, my cabin was what lawyers call non-conforming use, legally established. Basically meaning, it was here first, so new rules don't apply. I'd spent hours at the county clerk's office learning that grandfather clauses protect old structures from modern regulations. Smart folks dealing with code harassment should always check if their property predates the rules being enforced. "Sir, when was this structure built exactly?" The senior inspector was running his hands over my hand-hewn support beams, admiring the craftsmanship. I spread out my documentation like a poker player revealing a royal flush. Building permits from 1890, survey maps, legal precedents, the works. Every regulation Delilah was trying to use against me simply didn't apply to a cabin that predated them by 60 years. The inspector spent 2 hours crawling through every corner. My 1962 septic system was still functioning perfectly. The electrical work, updated in 1995, exceeded current safety standards. The well water tested cleaner than anything piped in from the city treatment plant. As they packed up their gear, the lead inspector shook his head. "Mr. Caldwell, your property is in full compliance, better maintained than most new construction, honestly. We'll file our report today." Through my kitchen window, I watched Delilah's face contort as the inspectors delivered the news, her jaw clenched tight enough to crack those perfect veneers. But the woman was far from finished. That afternoon brought my first real taste of her cunning. I returned from town to find her Tesla parked sideways across my driveway entrance, blocking all access to my property. When I approached, she rolled down her window with a smile that could freeze hell itself. "Oh, Rex, I'm so sorry. I was just checking our property boundaries." She gestured toward the ground with manicured nails. "This area right here, it's technically HOA common space according to our newest survey." The scent of mountain pine couldn't mask the stench of her lies. My driveway had been worn smooth by 3 generations of Caldwell vehicles since 1923. But here was the twist that caught me off guard. She'd had the HOA commission a brand new boundary survey, one that conveniently adjusted the property lines to include my access road. "Ma'am, you're blocking legal right-of-way access that's been established for a century." "I don't think so, sweetie. But feel free to call the sheriff if you disagree." Her tone dripped false concern. She knew Sheriff Martinez wouldn't arrest the HOA president over a property dispute without ironclad evidence. For the next week, Delilah made my life miserable with surgical precision. Her Tesla appeared at random times like a white specter, always blocking something critical. She photographed my violations with the dedication of a wildlife photographer, firewood stacked too high, my truck parked at the wrong angle, General Patton relieving himself on what she claimed was sacred HOA grass. The woman even called the local newspaper herself. "Concerned citizen fights to maintain community standards," read the headline. She painted me as a hillbilly holdout threatening everyone's property values. Half the Alpine Vista residents swallowed her story whole. Nobody wants their $800,000 investment devalued by a neighbor with work boots and a functioning pickup truck. But something beautiful happened in response. The old mountain families, folks whose roots ran deeper than Delilah's bank account, started appearing at my door. They brought casseroles, offered help with repairs, and shared their own horror stories. Jake Morrison from the hardware store was fighting bogus noise complaints. Sarah Avery, a local nurse, was being harassed for her non-conforming vegetable garden. The community was splitting clean down the middle. Delilah's wealthy supporters versus everyone who just wanted to live without HOA tyranny. Meanwhile, General Patton became our unlikely mascot. My 100-pound bloodhound developed an uncanny ability to detect Delilah's Tesla from 3 blocks away, and he'd waddle over to mark his territory on her pristine white walls every single morning like clockwork. Even my dog has better judgment than the HOA board, I told Jake one afternoon, watching General Patton perform his daily constitutional on her tires. But I was about to discover that Delilah's war against my cabin was just the opening move in a much larger game. 2 weeks later, Delilah pulled out the heavy artillery. She called an emergency HOA meeting, complete with official county representatives. The community center was packed tighter than a Sunday service, tension thick as mountain fog. She'd invited County Commissioner Bradley Hicks and Fire Marshal Tom Rodriguez, guys who could actually shut me down if they wanted to. I walked into that room knowing I was outnumbered. The smell of burnt coffee and nervous sweat hung in the air. Delilah stood at the podium like she was addressing the United Nations, her white blazer practically glowing under the fluorescent lights. "Ladies and gentlemen," she began, her voice carrying that practiced authority she'd perfected in Seattle boardrooms. "We're here tonight because a dangerous structure threatens our entire community's safety and property values." She clicked through a PowerPoint presentation like some kind of disaster preparedness seminar. Photos of my cabin from every conceivable angle, arrows pointing at structural deficiencies that existed only in her imagination. The woman had turned my peaceful homestead into a horror movie. "This ramshackle building violates 17 separate safety codes," she declared, counting on her fingers for dramatic effect. "I'm formally requesting that Commissioner Hicks condemn this property as a public nuisance before someone gets hurt." Polite applause rippled through her supporters, mostly the newer Alpine Vista residents who'd never seen a real log cabin up close. But I noticed the old-timers staying silent, arms crossed, waiting to see what I'd pull out of my hat. I approached the podium carrying 3 manila folders, each one thicker than a phone book. The sound of my work boots on the wooden floor echoed through the suddenly quiet room like gunshots. "Commissioner, I appreciate Ms. Thornfield's creative interpretation of building safety." I opened the first folder. "But I think you'll find this structural engineer's report interesting." The certified report, completed just 2 days earlier, declared my cabin sound enough to survive another century. Every beam, joint, and foundation stone had been professionally inspected and rated. The engineer even noted that my great-grandfather's construction techniques were superior to most modern methods. Fire Marshal Rodriguez examined the documents with growing interest. "Mr. Caldwell, your property actually exceeds current fire safety standards. That metal roof, the defensible space around your structure, it's better protected than most new construction." I could hear Delilah's breathing change from across the room, but here's where she showed me just how desperate she was getting. During the question period, she stood up with theatrical indignation. "This isn't about safety anymore," she announced, dropping her pretense. "It's about preserving the character of our investment. That cabin is an eyesore that affects everyone's property values. Mr. Caldwell needs to either upgrade to our community standards or sell to someone who will." The mask slipped completely. She wanted to buy my land. The room erupted in murmurs as people realized what they'd just witnessed. This wasn't about safety or community standards, it was a land grab, pure and simple. Delilah wanted my 40 acres for herself, probably to build some kind of luxury resort or wedding venue. My grandfather used to tell me that when opponents show their true cards, you've already won half the battle. I'd learned that lesson working oil rigs, where desperate supervisors always revealed their weaknesses under pressure. Commissioner Hicks cleared his throat. "Ms. Thornfield, the county doesn't condemn private property to improve someone else's view. Mr. Caldwell's documentation appears to be in perfect order." But Delilah wasn't finished fighting dirty. Over the next few days, she launched a coordinated harassment campaign that would have impressed a military strategist. Noise complaints about my morning wood chopping, filed daily at exactly 7:01 a.m., 1 minute after the legal noise ordinance allowed such activities. She'd researched the regulations and was gaming the system. What she didn't know was that rural properties like mine are typically exempt from noise ordinances for agricultural activities. I'd learned this during my research binge, discovering that my property was still zoned as agricultural forestry, despite being surrounded by residential development. Wood processing counted as agricultural work, which meant her complaints were legally meaningless. I decided to turn her harassment into community building. Every morning when I split firewood, I invited neighbors to come grab free logs for their own fireplaces. Soon I had a regular crowd showing up, families who appreciated good oak and maple more than HOA politics. The hardware store's Jake Morrison brought his teenage son to help stack wood. Sarah Avery started bringing fresh-baked muffins for the volunteers. Even some of the newer Alpine Vista residents began joining us, drawn by the genuine community spirit that Delilah's rules had been strangling. Her perfect plan was backfiring spectacularly. Instead of isolating me, her attacks were bringing people together. The sound of axes and splitting mauls became a daily symphony of resistance, punctuated by laughter and the clink of coffee mugs. General Patton appointed himself official greeter for the morning wood-chopping crew, his tail wagging like a flag of defiance every time Delilah drove past in her increasingly frustrated Tesla patrols. But I could see the calculation in her eyes changing. If legal harassment wouldn't work, she was about to try something much more dangerous. Delilah's next move came at me from a direction I never saw coming. I was replacing rotted boards on my porch when a black sedan pulled up my driveway. Out stepped a wiry man in a cheap suit carrying a briefcase, private investigator written all over him. "Rex Caldwell? Name's Dennis Polk. I'm conducting a routine background investigation. Got a few minutes?" Behind him, Delilah sat in her Tesla like a general watching a battlefield. She'd hired herself a PI to dig up dirt on me, probably hoping to find unpaid taxes, criminal records, anything she could use to paint me as unfit for decent society. I invited Dennis up to the porch, offered him sweet tea. The man spent an hour asking questions about my time in Alaska, my finances, my family history. Professional, but fishing for something specific. The whole time, I could smell Delilah's desperation drifting up from her car like expensive perfume mixed with panic sweat. 2 days later, the legal papers arrived. A formal lawsuit claiming property boundary disputes, demanding I pay $50,000 in legal fees and 3 years of back HOA assessments. She was betting I couldn't afford a court fight against her Seattle law firm connections. That's when I decided to visit Ephraim Jacobs, the 78-year-old surveyor who'd mapped half of Montana over his 50-year career. His office smelled like old leather and pipe tobacco, walls covered with hand-drawn property maps that looked like works of art. "Rex boy, I surveyed this land for your grandfather back in '72, Ephraim said, pulling out a thick folder of yellowed documents. "But let me show you something interesting about the original homestead boundaries." He spread out a 1890s territorial survey map, tracing property lines with a gnarled finger. My jaw dropped as I realized what I was looking at. The original Caldwell homestead wasn't just 40 acres around my cabin. It encompassed nearly 400 acres, including half of what was now Alpine Vista Estates. "Ephraim, are you telling me my great-grandfather owned land that's now under their development?" The old man's eyes twinkled. "Son, according to these original documents, your family owned everything from Copper Creek to Eagle Ridge. That's where it gets real interesting. When your grandfather sold parcels over the years, he retained the mineral and water rights. Standard practice back then." My heart started pounding as the implications hit me. Every fancy house in Alpine Vista was technically built over my family's retained subsurface rights. Delilah's million-dollar lots were sitting on top of water and mineral rights that still belonged to me. I spent the next week at the county courthouse digging through deed records like an archaeological expedition. Every property transfer confirmed what Ephraim had told me. The Caldwell family had retained subsurface rights on hundreds of acres. My ancestors had been smarter than I'd given them credit for. The beauty of it was breathtaking. Delilah had spent months researching surface property laws, building codes, and HOA regulations, but she'd completely missed the underground legal foundation that could bring her entire development crashing down. While I was discovering my family's buried treasure, Delilah was escalating to pure desperation. She filed false police reports claiming I'd threatened her during our property dispute. Called the sheriff 3 times in 1 week, each story more dramatic than the last. "She's claiming you followed her to the grocery store and made threatening gestures," Sheriff Martinez told me, clearly embarrassed. "Rex, I've known you since you were knee-high. This woman's losing her mind." I'd learned in Alaska that when people get cornered, they either surrender or go completely crazy. Delilah was choosing option 2. She organized a media campaign calling me a dangerous mountain hermit who threatened community safety. Local TV ran her story, complete with dramatic interviews about feeling terrorized by her neighbor. But I had something she didn't: the quiet support of working people who recognized genuine character. Veterans groups started showing up at my cabin, offering solidarity. The regional newspaper began investigating HOA overreach stories. Even the state property rights advocacy group reached out with offers of pro bono legal help. The funniest part was watching Delilah's own HOA board start distancing themselves from her increasingly unhinged behavior. Her dramatic accusations were making reasonable people uncomfortable. Board members who'd initially supported her community standards crusade began questioning whether she'd gone too far. I remember one evening sitting on my porch with General Patton, watching Delilah practice her victim routine in her Tesla down by the mailbox. She was rehearsing dramatic gestures in her rearview mirror, preparing for another media interview. "Patton, that woman's digging her own grave with a silver spoon," I told my faithful hound. He thumped his tail in agreement, then trotted down to leave his daily calling card on her white walls. The next morning brought news that changed everything. My retained mineral and water rights weren't just a legal curiosity. They were about to become the nuclear option that could end this war permanently. But first, I had to decide whether I was the kind of man who'd use that power, or if there was a better way to win. The bombshell dropped on a Tuesday morning while I was researching case law at the county clerk's office. Margaret Peterson, the clerk who'd been filing deeds since the Carter administration, was helping me trace my family's property history when she pulled out a leather-bound ledger I'd never seen before. "Rex, honey, you might want to sit down for this," she said, her reading glasses perched on her nose like a wise old owl. "I was going through the territorial records from the 1920s, and I found something that'll knock your socks clean off." She opened the ledger to a page marked with a faded ribbon. There, in my great-grandfather's careful handwriting, was a land grant document that made my blood run cold. Not 40 acres, not even 400 acres. The original Caldwell homestead encompassed the entire Pinevale County territory, all 12,000 acres of mountain wilderness, forests, and valleys. "Margaret, this can't be right. My family never owned the whole county." "Oh, but they did, sugar. Your great-grandfather Josiah was appointed Territorial Land Commissioner in 1889. When Montana achieved statehood, he was granted this entire section as payment for his government service. Look here." She pointed to an official seal pressed into the yellowed paper. "Territory of Montana, signed by the governor himself." My hand shook as I read the document. Every creek, every ridge, every acre that was now divided into dozens of private properties had once belonged to my family. But that wasn't even the shocking part. "Margaret, what happened to all this land? How did we lose it?" "You didn't lose it, honey. Your grandfather and great-grandfather sold parcels over the decades, but look at these clauses." She traced a line of legal text with her finger. "They retained mineral rights, water rights, and subsurface usage agreements on every single sale. Every property deed in this county contains those retained rights clauses." The room started spinning as the implications hit me. Delilah's precious Alpine Vista development, every house, every manicured lawn, every swimming pool, all of it was built over water and mineral rights that legally belonged to me. I could shut off their water supply tomorrow if I wanted to. "Margaret, does this mean what I think it means?" "Rex, according to these documents, you own the water table under every house in Alpine Vista. You own the mineral rights under the county courthouse, the school, the shopping center, everything. Your family has been sitting on legal ownership of this entire valley for over a century." I sat in that dusty office for 3 hours, reading and rereading documents that could make me richer than every Alpine Vista resident combined. Or I could use them to destroy Delilah's development so completely that property values would crater overnight. The moral weight of it crushed down on my shoulders like a fallen tree. My grandfather had taught me that power unused wisely becomes power misused. 3 generations of Caldwells had chosen community harmony over personal profit, never exercising rights that could have made us millionaires. But now I held legal documents that could end Delilah's harassment permanently. I could demand compensation from every property owner in the county, or I could bankrupt her development with a single court filing. The choice was mine. Walking back to my truck, I remembered something my grandfather used to say. "Son, the difference between a good man and a great man is what he does when nobody's watching and everybody's counting on him." Delilah had no idea that her victim owned the legal foundation her entire world was built on. But more importantly, I had to decide what kind of man I wanted to be when this war finally ended. The answer was starting to form in my mind, and it was bigger than revenge. That night, I sat on my porch with a mason jar of grandfather's moonshine, staring at those yellowed documents spread across my kitchen table like battle plans. General Patton sensed my mood and pressed his massive head against my knee, offering silent support. The mountain air carried the scent of pine and possibility, but also the weight of enormous responsibility. I could destroy Delilah with a single court filing, But destroying her meant destroying innocent families who'd invested their life savings in Alpine Vista homes. Kids would lose their bedrooms, retirees would lose their nest eggs, working families would face bankruptcy. That wasn't justice. That was revenge dressed up in legal paperwork. There had to be a better way. The next morning, I started making phone calls. First was Sarah Blackwood, an environmental lawyer I'd read about in the regional newspaper. She specialized in community land preservation and had a reputation for finding win-win solutions to complex property disputes. "Mr. Caldwell, what you're describing sounds like a perfect candidate for a community land trust," she said during our phone conversation. "It's a legal structure that separates land ownership from home ownership. Residents own their houses, but the community collectively owns the underlying land." Sarah agreed to drive up from Missoula that weekend. When she arrived at my cabin, she brought along Dr. Ruby Sterling, a conservation biologist who'd been mapping endangered species habitats throughout Montana. Ruby took one look at my property and nearly jumped out of her hiking boots. "Rex, do you realize you've got 3 endangered species living on this land? Northern bog lemmings, grizzly bear corridors, and old-growth forest habitat that's been undisturbed for centuries." Her eyes lit up like a kid on Christmas morning. "This could qualify for federal protection status." The third member of my unofficial brain trust was Harold Finch, the local banker who'd been financing mountain properties for 40 years. Harold understood the development economics better than anyone, and more importantly, he understood people. "Son, what you're talking about is revolutionary," Harold said, examining the territorial documents with a banker's careful eye. "Community land trusts exist in over 250 locations across the country. They prevent gentrification while preserving communities. Residents typically save 25 to 50% on housing costs compared to traditional ownership." Over the next 2 weeks, we hammered out a plan that was both simple and brilliant. The Pinevale County Conservation Trust would own all the land cooperatively, while residents maintained ownership of their homes. Instead of Delilah's HOA dictatorship, we'd have democratic governance where every resident got an equal vote on community decisions. The financial mechanics were elegant. My water and mineral rights would become the trust's foundational assets, providing long-term revenue for infrastructure and conservation programs. Current residents could buy into the trust at affordable rates, with their property values protected but speculation prevented. Sarah explained how other communities had made similar transitions work. In Vermont, the Champlain Housing Trust has preserved affordability for over 3,000 families while maintaining property values. The key is making sure everyone benefits, not just the original landowner. The conservation component was Dr. Ruby's passion project. We'd preserve 8,000 acres as protected wilderness while allowing sustainable development on the remaining 4,000 acres. Federal conservation grants could fund hiking trails, environmental education centers, and wildlife research facilities. I learned that community land trusts had prevented displacement in expensive areas like San Francisco and Burlington, while creating economic opportunities through sustainable tourism and green businesses. The model had been tested and proven successful for decades. Harold ran the numbers on sustainable tourism revenue. "Rex, with proper marketing, this could create 47 permanent jobs: guides, maintenance, education staff, hospitality. The economic impact would benefit everyone in the valley, not just trust members." During our planning sessions around my kitchen table, I watched these 3 professionals get genuinely excited about transforming a property dispute into a community renaissance. The smell of wood smoke from my fireplace mixed with the aroma of Sarah's endless coffee brewing as we worked late into mountain evenings. The legal structure would require 75% approval from current residents, which meant convincing people that cooperation was better than competition. We'd need to overcome decades of individualistic thinking and show folks that shared ownership could mean shared prosperity. "The beautiful thing about community land trusts," Sarah explained, "is that they're inherently democratic. No more HOA presidents making unilateral decisions. Every major choice gets voted on by the entire community." As we finalized our presentation materials, I realized what we were really creating wasn't just a legal solution. It was a return to the values my great-grandfather had embodied when he first settled this valley: community over profit, cooperation over conflict, stewardship over exploitation. The plan would transform Delilah's tyrannical development into something my ancestors would be proud of. But first, I had to survive her final desperate attacks and convince an entire community that there was a better way forward. General Patton thumped his tail approvingly as we sealed the presentation folders. Even my dog knew we were onto something special. Delilah must have sensed something was shifting in the wind. While I was quietly building my dream team and planning the future, she was watching my cabin through binoculars like some kind of suburban spy. Her paranoia reached new heights when she spotted Sarah's legal briefcase and Dr. Ruby's official state vehicle parked in my driveway during our planning sessions. "That mountain man is plotting something," I overheard her telling another HOA board member at the post office. Her voice had taken on a shrill edge that made the postal clerk wince. "He's meeting with lawyers and government officials. Mark my words, he's planning to sue us all into bankruptcy." She wasn't wrong about the plotting part, but she'd completely misunderstood my intentions. In Delilah's world, every legal consultation meant litigation. Every official meeting meant someone was getting destroyed. The idea that I might be working toward a solution that benefited everyone was beyond her comprehension. Her response was swift and vicious. Within days, she'd organized what she called a community safety patrol, basically a neighborhood watch program designed to spy on my every move. Volunteer residents took shifts monitoring my property from the road, documenting my visitors, photographing my activities, and reporting back to their fearless leader. The harassment escalated when she convinced 3 HOA board members to file a joint restraining order against me, claiming I'd made threatening statements during our previous encounters. The sheriff served the papers on a Thursday morning, looking more embarrassed than I'd ever seen a lawman. "Rex, I'm sorry about this, but I have to follow procedure," Sheriff Martinez said, handing me the legal documents. "She's claiming you told her you'd make her pay during that HOA meeting." What I'd actually said was that her harassment would backfire eventually, but Delilah had twisted my words into legal ammunition. The restraining order prohibited me from coming within 500 feet of any HOA property or events, effectively trapping me on my own land like a prisoner. But her masterpiece of manipulation came when she contacted the state environmental agency, filing a formal complaint claiming my cabin was polluting the county's water supply. She'd somehow discovered my meetings with Dr. Ruby and assumed they were about environmental violations rather than conservation planning. "Mr. Caldwell, we've received serious allegations about potential groundwater contamination from your property," said the environmental inspector who arrived unannounced on Friday morning. "We'll need to conduct soil and water testing immediately." While the inspector collected samples, Delilah held court across the road, explaining to anyone who'd listen how she was protecting the community from environmental disaster. Her performance attracted a small crowd of concerned residents, exactly as she'd planned. The irony was delicious. My property had the cleanest water in the county, fed by an underground spring that had been pure for centuries. The environmental tests would prove that my land was actually improving local water quality, not harming it. But Delilah was betting that the investigation itself would damage my reputation before the results came back. Meanwhile, I continued my quiet preparation for the community land trust proposal. Sarah had filed preliminary paperwork with the county, Dr. Ruby had completed her endangered species survey, and Harold was finalizing the financial projections. Every piece was falling into place for our big reveal. The environmental inspector returned the following week with test results that vindicated everything Dr. Ruby had told me. "Mr. Caldwell, your property shows zero contamination and actually helps filter groundwater for the entire valley. Whoever filed this complaint was either misinformed or malicious." I could have demanded an investigation into Delilah's false environmental reporting, but that would have been playing her game. Instead, I used the clean test results as another building block for the Conservation Trust proposal. Federal environmental protection would be easier to obtain with documented proof of habitat quality. Delilah's escalating tactics were having an unintended consequence. They were alienating reasonable people who'd initially supported her community standards crusade. The safety patrols, restraining orders, and false environmental complaints made her look increasingly unstable, rather than protective. Sarah Avery, the nurse with the non-conforming garden, stopped by my cabin one evening with a basket of fresh vegetables and some inside information. "Rex, half the HOA board wants to remove Delilah as president. Her spending on lawyers and investigators is bankrupting the association, and people are getting tired of the drama. Even some of her wealthy supporters were questioning whether the cure had become worse than the disease." Property values weren't threatened by my rustic cabin. They were threatened by living in a community at war with itself. The smell of autumn leaves and wood smoke filled the evening air as I sat planning my next move. General Patton had stopped his daily Tesla tire marking routine, sensing that bigger changes were coming. The old dog's instincts were right. We were about to transform this conflict into something nobody, including Delilah, could have imagined. Delilah's final act of desperation came on a crisp October morning when I least expected it. I was splitting oak logs behind my cabin when Jake Morrison from the hardware store came tearing up my driveway in his pickup, gravel spraying like buckshot. "Rex, you need to know what that woman's up to," he said, jumping out of his truck with his face red as a stop sign. "She tried to bribe Commissioner Hicks yesterday, offered him a $50,000 campaign contribution if he'd condemn your property as a health hazard." My axe stopped mid-swing. Even knowing Delilah's capacity for manipulation, attempted bribery of county officials crossed a line I hadn't imagined she'd dare approach. The smell of split wood and morning dew couldn't mask the stench of corruption that was following her around like cheap perfume. "Jake, how do you know this?" "Because Hicks called Sheriff Martinez immediately after she left his office. He was so disgusted he wanted it on record. But that's not all. She's hired some outside HOA management company from Denver. They're supposed to take aggressive legal action against problem residents." The management company she'd recruited had a reputation that made loan sharks look ethical. Mountain Property Solutions specialized in hostile takeovers of struggling HOA communities, jacking up fees and forcing out long-term residents to flip properties for luxury development. Their motto was literally maximum property value through strategic enforcement. Within 48 hours, I received certified letters demanding immediate payment of $73,000 in accumulated fines, legal fees, and emergency assessments. They'd calculated 3 years of retroactive HOA dues at $500 per month, plus daily violation penalties for everything from my truck's faded paint to General Patton's unauthorized pet waste on their precious common areas. But here's where Delilah's desperation revealed her fatal mistake. In hiring outside enforcement, she'd lost control of the narrative. Mountain Property Solutions didn't care about community relations or local politics. They were purely mercenary, which made longtime Alpine Vista residents nervous about their own future treatment. The company's representatives were everything mountain folks despise: slick-talking city boys in expensive suits who treated local people like obstacles to profit. Their leader, a weasel-faced man named Marcus Brennan, actually told Sarah Avery that her vegetable garden was incompatible with luxury community standards and would need to be removed immediately. "Ma'am, we're implementing comprehensive property value enhancement protocols," Brennan explained to a packed HOA meeting, his voice dripping with corporate buzzword nonsense. "Non-conforming elements must be eliminated to preserve investment integrity." Translation: anyone who didn't fit their country club vision would be regulated, fined, or sued out of existence. Delilah had essentially hired corporate bullies to finish what she'd started, not realizing that this would unite the entire community against her. Meanwhile, my secret weapon was nearing activation. The FBI's Public Corruption Unit had been quietly investigating Delilah's bribery attempt, and their interest expanded when they discovered Mountain Property Solutions was under federal investigation for racketeering in 3 other states. Her timing couldn't have been worse. Sarah completed the legal paperwork for the Community Land Trust just as federal environmental protection was approved for my property's endangered species habitat. Dr. Ruby's biological survey had identified critical breeding grounds for threatened wildlife, which meant federal law now trumped local HOA regulations entirely. The banking consortium Harold had assembled was ready to finance the community transition for any residents who wanted to participate. We'd structured the deal so that current homeowners could maintain their property values while gaining protection from future speculation and HOA tyranny. But Delilah was oblivious to the constitutional convention brewing in her backyard. She was too busy planning what she thought would be her final victory, a massive public confrontation that would destroy my reputation permanently and clear the way for her land acquisition dreams. She organized what she called an emergency community safety meeting for the following Thursday, complete with media invitations and a formal presentation about the ongoing threat to Alpine Vista's security and property values. Local TV stations were promised dramatic revelations about my dangerous activities and environmental crimes. What she didn't know was that I'd already scheduled my own presentation for the exact same meeting. County commissioners had agreed to hear my community land trust proposal. Federal wildlife agents would be present to discuss the endangered species protections, and Sarah had prepared a legal briefing that would change everything. General Patton seemed to sense that our long ordeal was finally approaching its climax. He'd stopped his daily Tesla tire marking routine and started following me everywhere with unusual attentiveness, as if he knew his human needed extra support for the battle ahead. The irony was perfect. Delilah had arranged her own public downfall, scheduling the meeting that would expose her corruption while revealing the solution that could transform our entire community. Sometimes justice has a sense of humor about timing. All that remained was surviving her final assault and delivering the mic drop moment that would end this war forever. The Pinevale County Community Center had never seen a crowd like this. Every folding chair was occupied. People lined the walls 3 deep, and local TV crews had their cameras positioned like this was some kind of political convention. The air buzzed with tension and whispered conversations, mixed with the scent of burnt coffee and nervous anticipation. I arrived 15 minutes early, carrying a single manila folder and wearing my best flannel shirt, the one without any holes. Sheriff Martinez nodded at me from his position near the back wall, flanked by 2 FBI agents who'd driven up from Billings. County Commissioner Hicks sat at the head table looking like a man who'd rather be anywhere else on earth. Delilah made her entrance like a prosecuting attorney approaching a murder trial. Designer suit, perfectly styled hair, briefcase that probably cost more than my truck. She'd brought reinforcements, Marcus Brennan from Mountain Property Solutions and 2 other corporate suits who looked like they'd been hired to intimidate small-town folks into submission. "Ladies and gentlemen," she began, her voice carrying across the packed room with practiced authority. "We're here tonight because our community faces an unprecedented threat to our safety, our property values, and our way of life." She clicked through a PowerPoint presentation that would have impressed a disaster preparedness seminar. Photos of my cabin from every conceivable angle, charts showing theoretical property value impacts, and a timeline of what she called my escalating antisocial behavior. "Rex Caldwell represents everything that threatens civilized community standards," she declared, pointing dramatically in my direction. "His refusal to comply with reasonable regulations has created a dangerous precedent that could destroy everything we've built here." The performance was masterful, hitting every fear button her audience possessed. She painted me as a backwards mountain hermit whose stubborn resistance was costing everyone money and peace of mind. "I'm formally requesting that the county commissioners exercise their authority to condemn this dangerous property before someone gets hurt," she concluded, with the flourish of a closing argument. "Mr. Caldwell has had multiple opportunities to be a good neighbor. Instead, he's chosen to wage war against progress and prosperity." Polite applause rippled through her supporters, though I noticed several people staying silent, arms crossed, waiting to hear the other side of the story. The old-timers knew something was coming. You could see it in their eyes. Commissioner Hicks cleared his throat. "Thank you, Ms. Thornfield. Mr. Caldwell, you've requested time to respond?" I stood up slowly, the sound of my work boots echoing through the suddenly quiet room like thunder. Every eye followed me to the podium, cameras zooming in for what they expected would be a stammering defense from an overwhelmed mountain man. "Commissioner Hicks, members of the community," I began, opening my manila folder with deliberate calm. "Ms. Thornfield has raised some interesting points about property rights and community standards. But before we discuss her concerns, I think everyone should know who actually owns the land we're talking about." I pulled out the territorial land grant document, yellowed with age but official as the Constitution itself. This is the original 1889 territorial grant that established the Caldwell homestead. Not 40 acres, as Ms. Thornfield believes, but the entire Pinevale County territory, all 12,000 acres of it. The room erupted in gasps and murmurs as I continued. Every property deed in Alpine Vista contains retained mineral and water rights clauses. The fancy houses, the manicured lawns, the swimming pools, they're all built over water rights that legally belong to my family and have for 135 years. Delilah jumped up like she'd been electrocuted. "That's impossible. I researched every deed, every regulation." "You researched surface property law, ma'am. You missed the subsurface rights that could shut off your water supply tomorrow if I chose to exercise them." The silence was deafening. You could have heard a pine needle hit the floor. Delilah's face cycled through disbelief, rage, and dawning horror as she realized the magnitude of her legal oversight. "But I'm not here to punish anyone," I continued, raising my voice over the growing crowd noise. "I'm here to offer something better than HOA tyranny or legal warfare." I gestured to Sarah, Dr. Ruby, and Harold, who stood up from their seats in the audience. "The Pinevale County Conservation Trust, a community land trust that would preserve 8,000 acres as protected wilderness while giving residents democratic control over their own neighborhood, ending HOA dictatorship forever." The standing ovation started with the old mountain families and spread through the crowd like wildfire. Even some Alpine Vista residents began applauding as they realized what I was offering: freedom from Delilah's rule and protection from future speculation. That's when FBI agent Patricia Morrison approached the podium with her badge displayed. Ms. Thornfield, you're under arrest for attempted bribery of a public official. As they read Delilah her rights, Marcus Brennan was quietly slipping toward the exit, probably hoping nobody noticed his company was also under federal investigation. The cameras captured every moment of her public humiliation. The woman who'd tried to destroy me was being perp-walked past the very people she'd claimed to protect. 30 days later, the entire valley gathered at my cabin for what we called the Great Decision Barbecue. The smell of hickory smoke and autumn pine mixed with something I hadn't experienced in years, the scent of genuine community joy. Kids ran between picnic tables while their parents cast votes with the kind of excitement usually reserved for Christmas morning. The final tally made my grandfather's spirit smile from wherever mountain souls go to rest. 87% approval for the Pinevale County Conservation Trust. Even former Delilah supporters had discovered that Democratic governance beat HOA dictatorship every single time. Sarah Avery brought her famous green bean casserole, while Jake Morrison donated lumber for our makeshift voting booth. General Patton had appointed himself official greeter, his tail wagging like a victory flag as children who'd once feared the dangerous hermit's dog now smuggled him bacon scraps under the tables. By unanimous vote, I became the trust's first president, a title I accepted knowing real leadership meant lifting others up, not holding them down. Our first act established a community council representing every neighborhood, every demographic, every voice that had been silenced by corporate HOA tyranny. The transformation exceeded everyone's dreams. Property values stabilized while housing costs dropped for families joining the trust. Our 8,000-acre conservation easement attracted federal grants funding hiking trails, an environmental education center, and wildlife research facilities that brought scientists from across the country. Sustainable tourism created 47 permanent jobs, trail guides, environmental educators, lodge staff, and maintenance crews. Local businesses thrived as visitors came to witness democracy in action. Proof that communities choosing cooperation over conflict could prosper beyond anyone's imagination. Delilah's downfall became a cautionary tale spreading far beyond our mountains. Federal bribery charges cost her law license and resulted in 2 years probation, plus 500 hours community service. Mountain Property Solutions collapsed under racketeering investigations, their predatory business model finally exposed. Her Alpine Vista mansion sold at a loss to a young teacher's family who immediately planted vegetables in the front yard, exactly what she'd tried to prevent. The annual Pinevale Freedom Festival became our signature celebration, featuring local crafts, environmental education, and bluegrass music echoing off granite ridges. Last year's festival raised scholarship funds sending 12 mountain kids to college, continuing my grandfather's belief that education opens doors these mountains can't provide. Legal scholars from Harvard, Stanford, and University of Montana studied our transition as a model for communities facing corporate land grabs. The Caldwell Doctrine became legal shorthand for using inherited rights to benefit entire communities rather than enriching individuals. Sarah Blackwood's consultation requests multiplied so rapidly, she opened a nonprofit firm specializing in community land trust formations. 6 months after victory, a letter arrived from a Texas rancher facing identical HOA harassment, city developers surrounding rural property, demanding impossible compliance, using legal intimidation to force land sales. General Patton's ears perked up when I read that letter aloud, sensing adventure on the horizon. "Seems like tyranny spreads faster than wildfire these days, old boy," I told him, scratching behind his graying ears. "Maybe we ought to help that Texas fellow discover what we learned here." Our humble cabin became an unlikely pilgrimage site for property rights advocates and environmental conservationists. The combination of legal victory, community cooperation, and land preservation created a replicable model working everywhere except in corporate boardrooms and HOA management offices. But the real victory wasn't legal or financial, it was personal. Every evening, I sit on the porch my great-grandfather built, watching chimney smoke rise throughout the valley as families gather in homes they truly own. The pine trees whisper stories of justice served and communities healed, while General Patton snores contentedly, his daily Tesla-marking duties long retired. Sometimes the sweetest revenge isn't destroying enemies. It's proving that cooperation always defeats corruption, that quiet competence outlasts loud aggression, and that communities are strongest when built on shared values rather than shared fears. The mountain air carries the sound of children's laughter, the smell of home-cooked dinners, and the promise that tomorrow will be better than today because we chose to work together instead of tear each other apart. That's what real victory feels like, not defeating someone, but lifting everyone. So drop a comment below sharing your worst HOA nightmare story, and smash that subscribe button for HOA stories if you want more justice porn victories like this one. Where are you watching from? Let me know. I love hearing from folks who believe communities thrive when neighbors become allies instead of enemies.
Thanks for being here with us at HOA Stories. If you enjoyed today's showdown and seeing an HOA Karen get put in her place, click like, sound off in the comments, and subscribe to catch the next week's drama. You don't want to miss it.